I'm Catherine Gilbert, and I have been at the lodge a few times. The very first time was in 1981, and I was about to tell you how old I was then, but then I figured out that everybody could probably do the math, so I won't say anything about that. I'm going to do a little bit of review about what was actually going on in the area before the lodge began, because a lot of what happens at the lodge and a lot of what the lodge is about has to do with Strathcona Provincial Park. And this first picture I'm showing you is from the Ellison expedition of 1910. There had been explorers in the park before that. William Bolton was one of them. And it was perceived that the park was very wealthy in both timber and in gold. So there were a number of prospectors who prospected in the park for several years. However, what's important about the Ellison expedition is that when Price Ellison, who was the Minister of Lands, went through the park, he realized that this whole big area should be set aside as wilderness. In fact, he was directed by the government to make it into a national park. As it turned out, it actually became British Columbia's first provincial park, and that was in 1911. And it was because of that that we have this wonderful protected area. Although what's important to remember is that at the time, even though it was declared a park, industry was still allowed in the park. And that is why there is a mine at the end of Buttle Lake that we call Myra Falls. It's referred to as Myra Falls because of its location, since several different companies have owned the mine over the years. And this is a picture of Myra and Myra. And the Myra on this side is Myrna's grandmother, and the baby is Myrna's mother. Myrna's family were around this particular area for many years, and that was it was interesting that Myrna, even though she grew up in the Comox Valley, ended up establishing a lodge here because she visited so often when she was young. Her parents were very outdoorsy people. Her father loved to fish. They hiked together. Her father had a logging company with his brothers, and they logged throughout the area. And in fact, what's interesting about Myrna's grandmother is that Myra Falls was named after her. There was an explorer by the name of Mike King who came to this area in the late 1890s, and he met Myra when she was just a baby, and told her parents, I'm going to name this waterfalls that I saw after your daughter Myra. And then later, during the Price Ellison expedition, he had a daughter, Myra, who came on the trip, and he did the same thing. And I used to work at the museum at Campbell River in town, and they actually have created a puppet show that they show to children called The Two Myras, because it's just one of those strange ironies that these two same places were named after Myras by two different people. And this is a picture of Myrna's father and her mother in the middle, and her Aunt Rose hiking at Buttle Lake. So the road that we're so used to driving today used to be just a trail, and they called it the Buttle Lake Trail. This was taken in 1925, so you can see that very early on Myrna's family were in this area. And this is a picture of Myrna and her husband Jim when they were dating. They met at UBC, and Myrna was studying home economics, and Jim was studying phys ed. In fact, he was meant to be a football player. He was, of course, a university football player, but because of a knee injury, he had to make a change. And in fact, Strathcona Park Lodge probably wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the fact that Jim had this injury. They got married and had a very large wedding, about 300 people, because both of them came from very large extended families. Now at the time, before we had a lake here, this is what the valley looked like through here. And you may have heard that this is all, what we see out here today is all the product of flooding because of the dams that went in. And it really changed everything. There were a number of people who were against the damming of this whole system, particularly because initially the BC Power Commission, and they're called BC Hydro today, wanted to dam at Buttle Lake. And there was a very influential person who lived here by the name of Roderick Haig Brown. And he wrote that if they built a dam in Buttle Lake, they were going to disturb all of the places where the trout spawned, and he didn't want to see any of it disturbed. And he was also a great protector of the park. In fact, he influenced Jim and Myrna in many ways in their choices of how they decided to run the lodge. And this is a picture of the Strathcona Dam going in. So as you can see, it was created quite a bit of upheaval. But it's because of that that we see the lake in front of us today. Now, at the time that they were planning to flood this whole area, Myrna's father, Wallace, knew about this beautiful lodge that was actually called Strathcona Lodge, and found out that what was going to happen was that the BC Hydro was going to burn all these beautiful lodges that were around the lake. So he offered them $500 for it, and they took it. And what they did was they put it on a type of raft, and then as the lake rose, it floated across. And this is Myrna's father, Wallace. So this is it arrived at the shore here. And then what they had to do was pull it up the hill. And this is the lodge sitting at the top of the hill. Myrna's father and her brothers were given compensation for lands that they lost because they had logged this whole area. So when Myrna and Jim were thinking about starting up a boys' camp here, he said, well, you know, I've got this lodge here and I've got this acreage. Why don't you think about establishing your boys' camp here? So that was the reason for the lodge. Now, he also had a logging camp that he had in a place called Dolly Varden Point that's now under the water. And several of the cabins and bunkhouses and cookhouses that he had were floated over in the same manner. So when you're down at the lake today and you see all the cottages along there, they started their life as bunkhouses. And this is what the lodge property looked like in about 1960. So you can see where everything has certainly grown up a lot over the years, and the whole waterfront has changed tremendously. But also the lake was up much higher. This is what the road looked like in those days. So even though you might hear people complaining about the state of the road, you can see that it's a vast improvement now. Now, one thing that certainly the lodge has acknowledged is that because the mine is in the park, they've had to maintain the road. So that's been one positive effect of having a mine in the park. And that's another shot of the lodge in the early years. And here's Jim and Myrna. And there they are in the early 1960s, and I think you might be able to tell by the cars approximately what year it is, with their beautiful Strathcona Park Lodge. And this is what the interior of the lodge looked like. They hired Italian masons to actually build this beautiful stone fireplace in there, and it was quite lovely. And what happened when they opened the boys' camp was that they actually weren't very successful. And what they ended up doing instead was entertaining tourists. And what Myrna says in her book is that people would drive along the road and see this beautiful lodge and ask if they could stay. So she tells us that they actually stumbled into tourism quite accidentally. And they also stumbled into fish guiding. So what Jim would do was take people out to the west coast to Gold River, and they had a native guide who gave them a hand, and they would catch these amazing big tai that everybody wanted. This is a picture of Jim and Ted Peck, who had a fishing show at the time. So he came up and filmed his fishing show here. And there's a picture of the dining room. In those days, it was necessary to have white tablecloths everywhere because, believe it or not, that was part of the liquor laws, if that makes any sense. And I think a lot of people here are familiar with the dinner bell. That actually came from a train, and it was donated to the lodge from the museum. Now, I know that some people actually think it was the train bell from the train that used to be across the lake, because there was a time when they did railway logging in this area. And if you're ever up above on the opposite side of the highway in Camp Lake, you'll see some remnants of the rail lines. But there was a camp called Camp 9 across the way that's all underwater now. And for many years, the lodge had a reputation as of a place where hippies and vegetarians lived. So I always like to include this picture just to dispel that myth. But even, it's so funny to me that after all these years, and especially because I worked at the museum and would often hear people's comments about the lodge, they said, oh, that place is all vegetarian, isn't it? I said, no, really, you should come out to dinner because there's all kinds of things. Another favorite is the traditional native style salmon on the cedar, and if you have never tried it, you know, it's a wonderful opportunity if you can have it. When I first came, I had been living in California and didn't know anything about this, and Myrna told me to watch the fire and these cooking on the steaks, and I was just petrified that I was going to do it wrong because I didn't have any idea how long to cook it or turn it over. But nobody complained, so I guess it turned out all right. Here's Myrna's first 3 children. We have Liz, Annie, and Jamie when they were just young. What a fantastic place for her children to grow up. They learned how to do so many things. So if you wonder today why Jamie seems to know everything about everything to do with the lodge, it's because he was here from his infancy on up. If you can see in the background how differently the landscaping has changed around here, and they went to a lot of trouble to pull out all the stumps and plant all of the trees and the foliage and flowers that you see now. Now, a very famous person who was influential in the direction the lodge would go was Burl Ives. And I'm not sure how many people recognize him, but when I was young, Burl Ives was a very well-known folk singer. And if you've ever seen the story about the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer that they play every Christmas, and they have a snowman with a little pipe in his mouth and he does the narration, that's Burl Ives' voice. Now, what Burl Ives did was he said to Myrna and Jim, you know, instead of a boys' camp, why don't you think about turning this into some kind of outdoor education center? He said, my son is in England right now, studying with Outward Bound and doing their courses, and he said, I just think with everything that you have here, you should consider it. And that really turned things around for Jim and Myrna, and they actually went to England and they visited some of the Outward Bound schools, and at the same time they were pursuing their master's degrees in planning. And Myrna told me that that actually helped them very well in terms of deciding how they were going to handle the lodge. This is a picture of Roderick Haig Brown. He was another person who strongly influenced the direction that the Bouldings would go in. And as I mentioned before, he was known as a conservationist. He wrote many different books on fly fishing. And he would come up to the lodge and give seminars and talk to people about everything that he stood for. And there is an article about him in the Haig Brown House. The Haig Brown House was named after Roderick Haig Brown. This is a picture of the college building under construction. It was, as you can see around the property, there are many different buildings and they all had a purpose. The college building was built because there was a group called Friends World College, which was a Quaker college in the States. And they were going to do their university seminar here at the lodge. And it was built very quickly. Myrna has said that it was actually built too quickly, and she even had to help with shaking the roof, and she said, I'm no roofer. But they were desperate. They just had the place completed, and then about an hour later, everybody showed up. And there's a fellow in the middle with the dark hair and glasses by the name of Michael Rewald, who ended up staying on at the lodge, and he became a leader and instructor for many, many years and worked in maintenance. But they had a very innovative program. They were studying all kinds of wildlife and elk and wolves and all different things, so it was a wonderful program. And this is the cabin that Michael Rewald built that's down by the lake now. And this is what the lodge looked like in about 1970. And then sadly, in May of 1973, there was a horrendous fire and the entire lodge burnt down, and the buildings, Boldings and anyone who was staying there lost their belongings. And Myrna and Jim were in town actually when it happened. It was Myrna's birthday, and Jim was buying her flowers, and then they heard, oh, the lodge is on fire. But by the time they got back, they weren't able to save anything. And that's what it looked like when the fire was over. So what they had to do was move into the outdoor center that was under construction. Now, it's kind of interesting that every time a new building started on the lodge property, it was supposed to have been a maintenance shed, but that never seemed to happen. It always turned into something else. And they ended up having to house the office in the outdoor center, and downstairs that was meant to be stalls for the horses ended up being the laundry area, and then they had to put a big dining room in there plus accommodation. So the Bolding family lived on top of the outdoor center. And at one time there was a beautiful spiral staircase that was built by Myrna's son-in-law Toby, who you might have seen around the property, but it had to be removed because the fire marshal said it was a hazard. One of the ideas that Myrna's husband Jim had was that they should have some sort of a proper ski hill. So this was taken in Strathcona Park, and he would invite his more well-to-do friends from town, doctors and so on, and ask them to try out the ski hill. So they would actually go by helicopter to the top of the hill, but then he would ask them to figure out the best way down. And after many mishaps, they decided that they weren't going to fall for that one again. And then unfortunately, the whole idea for the ski hill had to be abandoned because there simply wasn't enough snow. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there has always been a very close relationship between the lodge and between Strathcona Park. And people at the lodge have always been very concerned about what happens in the park. As you know, there are many programs that take place in the park, and many people climb there, people canoe and kayak there and camp there. And at one time they were planning to actually put another mine in the park. And another thing they were concerned about was the tailings that were coming from the existing mine, polluting the water. All of this water not only feeds Strathcona Park Lodge, but it is the watershed for the city of Campbell River. And here's a picture of Jim with a placard saying Myra Creek is a polluted mess. And this is when they were protesting the tailings going into Buttle Lake. Now, the Boldings were able to attract some really wonderful and dedicated instructors in the early years. And this picture was taken in about 1975. So we have Ray Priest on this side, and next to him Jeff Evans. And on your far left is Jim Rudder, and in the middle row with the dark hair is Jim Force. And then Jim Bolding is here with baby little Josie's about 2 years old in that picture. And these were fellows who actually started teaching a program that became like the COLT program today. In this particular picture, they're posed with some school teachers. So they were helping the school teachers to learn outdoor skills so that they could teach them, turn around and teach them to their students. But there also was a time when the Boldings realized that they might not always be able to attract this caliber of instructor, so they would have to start creating their own instructors, and this is how the COLT program began. So at first they had a 3-week course called the Wilderness Leadership, and then in 1977 they had something called the Apprenticeship Program that was the same as the COLT program today and ran for 4 months. And this is a picture again of Ray Priest, Jeff Evans, and you might recognize the guy with the terrific mustache there running around the property by the name of David Bolding. Wasn't he a handsome guy back in the day? And he's Jim's nephew. There was a very, very funny newsletter that was written by one of the office staff in the 70s, and somebody did this sketch of Jeff Evans. And it was called Singing Waters or Swinging Waters. The name changed about every week, but it was always full of good cartoons and poetry and funny stories. This is a picture of 2 other resource people who actually became very well known, particularly Hillary Stewart, who's pictured on your left. and she wrote a book about cedar. That is a really terrific book if you can get a hold of a copy, because she talked to First Nations people and really investigated what the uses of cedar were on the West Coast. And she would give talks here about that, and she would go on the West Coast and do survival trips. And really a well-loved and well-remembered person. And with her is her friend Joy Inglis, an anthropologist, and they both lived on Quadra Island, but were resource people for the lodge and spent an awful lot of time here. And here's a picture of Hillary in this very room giving a talk about First Nations culture. Now, one of the concepts that the Bouldings were coming up with was something called the Rural Resource Village. And they were trying to work on an idea of sustainability. So as anybody who has been living here is aware, the lodge produces its own power, and they have always aimed to try to be as self-sufficient as possible. So the Rural Resource Village was supposed to be a place where people would learn about recycling and about striving to live together in some kind of a community. In fact, when I was here, the lodge was thought of as a commune among many of us who lived here, because at the time there was a commune on Denman Island and there was one at 100 Mile House, and the lodge was part of this circuit that people would live on. So after the busy season was over, people would move from place to place. And I think that's where the reputation developed in town that this was a hippie commune, because actually people who lived here thought it was too. And as you can see, gardening was certainly promoted, and there was a really prolific garden right below the whale room for many years. And it turned out that it was prolific because that's where the septic field was. So that was moved. And the fellow with the very bushy beard, his name was Adrian, and he actually came from Holland originally. And he's sitting there with Jim, and he said that one of his favorite trips was to go to the West Coast with Jim. Adrian was a great guy to have around because he was a heavy-duty mechanic, and he worked for Western Forest Products in Gold River. And for many, many years, he kept a small cabin here, and would, even while he was working for the logging company, would maintain all of the lodge vehicles. And then Adrian lived also on Quadra Island, and sadly passed away quite suddenly of cancer a couple of years ago. Another person that they knew on the West Coast was Ray Williams. So for those of you who have been to Nootka Island, Ray and his wife Terry are the last two people of the Mawashat who live on Nootka Island. And he said when they were moving the band over to Gold River, he and his wife just didn't want to go. He would take people fishing for the Bouldings. And this is a picture of their boat, the Fair Isle, and people getting ready to go on a West Coast trip. And this is a picture of the camp on the beach. And starting a fire. And canoeing on the West Coast. There was, the apprentices of 1981 had a very harrowing experience when they had to canoe during a storm on the West Coast. And Karen Schwam, who was here at the time and ended up being at the lodge for a very long time afterwards, wrote a very good poem that's in the book if you're interested in reading her story about the scary trip that they had on the West Coast. And kayaking lessons. And this fella, Dave Fries, was here when I was here in 1981 and was an ace kayaker, as you can see in the whitewater. And Dave went on to work for the College of the Caribou, and most recently was at the University of Thompson Rivers, and used to bring some of his groups back to the lodge, and Dave just recently retired. Now you might recognize this fella, I'm not sure. I don't remember when Rob Wood did his presentation, if he showed you any pictures of himself when he was young. I think he did, but it wasn't this particular one. So this is Rob with his wife Lori getting married here at the lodge. And this is what they used to do on the apprenticeship trips. And I don't know if they put you through this or not, or if this was a requirement, but people always find a way to have fun. And this is one of the COLT groups on a mountain trek. And this particular group are with a fellow by the name of Tim Ripple, who was one of the instructors for the COLT group, and he actually has a company now called Peak Freaks that you might have heard of. He climbed Everest, yes. So the lodge over the years has drawn some really tremendous instructors and resource people, and these people have gone on to do things that are equally tremendous. This is a picture of Jim and Myrna discussing money matters. As you can imagine, trying to run a property like this that has to be self-sustaining in so many ways is a big challenge, particularly when you have a lot of staff. This is when the seal house was being built, and it was built, actually named after the fellow who helped build it, Craig Seal. And he. That's the barn. Oh, is that the barn? I thought you couldn't see the water from the barn.
Not anymore. Yeah.
Oh, not anymore. You can't. Oh, okay. Well, the barn was built in 1982, and many of the buildings that were built around the lodge were done with the help of a Katimovich group that came here in 1978. So I'm not sure if they knew anything or had any inkling of what they would be expected to do, like hauling timber around and sawing and so on. Now, their leader was a fellow by the name of Harold Macy, who is now a writer in Merville. And what Harold said about being at the lodge was, he said, it's like malaria when you have the lodge experience. Once you've had it, it always comes back. This is a picture of some children at the folk festival. So the folk festival started up in about 1978 and ran for almost 30 years. And it was great fun. It would bring the lodgies back as a kind of reunion. It first started as an end of the year kind of a celebration. And then every year it carried on, and then people who had left the lodge would come back. And there were many, many talented musicians who were part of the folk festival, including Valdi, who you might have heard of, who's a famous musician from Salt Spring Island. And this is yours truly with the man that I married in 1981. This was our wedding photo, by the way. Now, the person who I worked in the office with was Nancy. This is Myrna's aunt. Myrna asked Nancy to come and take care of Nick, who was just about 2 years old in that picture, and Josie. So she was willing to do so, but then suddenly found herself in the office. And she didn't exactly want to work in the office, but then she was promised that if she would stay, they would build her a nice cabin. So the cabin that you see down there that says Nancy's Cabin, and I believe all the COLT students stay in there, was built for Aunt Nancy. And then after a couple of years in the office, Myrna asked Nancy if she knew how to make scones, and since she did, she ended up in the kitchen for about 12 years. So always be careful if Myrna asks you if you know how to do something, because you might do it for about 12 years. Now, one thing that surprised me so much when I was here the first time was people belaying off the roof of this building. So I would look out the window and hear this belay, and then people would drop down right in front of me. And I had never been to an outdoor education center before. I didn't know anything about rock climbing or mountain climbing. And, but I was to find out years later that the lodge is a wonderfully unique place, and everything here was done in a wonderfully unique way. This is what the ropes course used to look like in those years. And I can't even believe that at the time I did the ropes course without a helmet or carabiner or anything. And since then, of course, things have become much safer. Now, many of the apprentices used to stay in these tent cabins that you don't see anymore, but there are staff cabins down below where they used to be below the college building. But I thought they were pretty neat, and as you can see, they glow in the dark. And I don't think the apprentices minded at all living in the tent cabins. This is a picture of the barn completed. That was a big project that they initiated based on a grant to help people get back to work. And this is a picture of the Boulding family in about 1979, 1980. And this is a picture of Jim, who unfortunately became ill with pancreatic cancer in 1984, and he passed away in 1986. Then it was up to Myrna to run the lodge, and she asked for Jamie to help her. He was at that time getting his phys ed degree in Victoria, but he left university and came to help Myrna with the lodge. Jim was certainly a character. I think Rob Wood spoke fairly extensively about Jim, about he was not afraid to do anything or try anything. And I think what most people felt from Jim was this inspiration to try things that you thought you never could do. But I have to say that I also felt that way with Myrna. I felt that Myrna really encouraged me to do new things, and she would always get the best out of people. So she would ask you to try this and do that, and you would find yourself in all different places in the lodge doing all kinds of things you never thought you were capable of. And she was just as good as Jim at bringing the best out of people, but I don't think she got quite the recognition for that. And of course, the lodge is still running today, and that is in so much because of Myrna and all of the energy that she puts into it daily. Because who else would run around the property looking for flowers to put on the dining room table except for Myrna, because she still cares so much about the lodge. As COLT students, I hope that you have felt some of the spirit that is around the lodge. It was really wonderful when Myrna and Brian had their big birthday party, and I got to see a lot of the old lodgies, as everybody becomes known. And one of the fellows made a comment about, he said, when you've been at the lodge and you meet all these people and you're part of the same thing, it's like a feeling of tribe. And I'd never thought of it that way. And I thought, yeah, what a wonderful thing, because, for example, when I came back in 2001, I met Teresa for the first time. And we hadn't been here in the same year, but we had been here just a year apart and knew many of the same people and had experienced many of the same things. And being at the lodge, even for a brief period, can connect you with the community. And many of those people will be your friends for years and years. And the lodge is a place that you always feel welcoming.